This is part one of a two-part series covering in detail the way recoil is handled in Tarkov. Part one will be discussing and explaining all of the hidden attributes that control the way weapons handle, as well as some constructive criticism of the implementation of some of these values, and my opinions of what can be done to improve the recoil impulse we experience in-game and bring it closer to real life. Part two will be demonstrating what changing these values actually translates into in-game. However, due to the rules of the subreddit restricting this footage, the second video will be linked in the video description on YouTube. The first thing I wanted to touch on are the hidden values that control every aspect of recoil in Tarkov. There are 6 of them in total that govern the recoil system: recoil force up, recoil force back, convergence, recoil angle, recoil dispersion, and camera recoil. However, only 2 of these values, recoil force up and recoil force back, are displayed in game, and only one of them, the vertical recoil stat, actually does as the name suggests. Recoil force up is the vertical recoil stat that we see in game when looking at weapons. This stat controls 2 things: how much the gun jumps on the initial first few shots before your PMC starts compensating, as well as the amount of muzzle climb between shots after the gun is stabilized. Recoil force back is actually the horizontal recoil stat that we see in game. This can be confusing as this stat actually doesn't have any effect on horizontal recoil whatsoever. What this stat actually does is affect how much recoil the weapon has, or how much force is pushing on your PMC shoulder while firing. The higher the number, the more the gun pushes back against your PMC. Convergence is the auto recoil compensation system. This stat controls the time it takes after firing the first shot before your PMC begins to compensate for the recoil. The higher this value, the quicker your PMC compensates for recoil. Recoil angle is the direction in which the rifle's muzzle moves when firing. 90 degrees is straight up. Higher numbers push the muzzle to the right, lower numbers push the muzzle to the left. Recoil dispersion affects the random jump to the left or right after each shot. This stat, not recoil force back, is what controls how much horizontal recoil your weapon actually has. Last but not least is camera recoil, which is how much the camera representing your PMC's eyes move while firing. Contrary to popular belief, camera recoil when set correctly can actually help with recoil control. I'll demonstrate what I'm talking about here in the second video. Every single one of these stats can be tweaked on a weapon-by-weapon basis by the developers. 2 of these stats, in my opinion, have a much higher impact on the weapon's handling than all of the rest, and that's recoil dispersion and convergence. Important to note again, neither of these stats are available to view anywhere in game. This is a publicly available spreadsheet showing recoil dispersion, convergence, recoil angle, and camera recoil values for every single gun in the game. The link for it will be available in the video description below. In my testing, convergence actually had a higher impact in the vertical recoil of a weapon than recoil force up did, and determined how quickly the reticle returned to center for follow-up shots in semi-auto. It was previously believed that fire rate was the primary determining factor on why certain weapons like the MP7 and the HK returned to center after the initial recoil jump much faster than other weapons. But due to the recoil changes in 12.12, we now know that the convergence stat is the primary reason that certain weapons, such as the M4 and the HK, jump so much on the first few shots and end up not actually returning to the original point of aim, now in 12.12. As I mentioned earlier, recoil dispersion is the equivalent of a horizontal recoil modifier. This stat is the reason why the SCAR L seems to have much more controllable horizontal recoil than the UMP does, for instance. Increasing this value gives more pronounced random jumps to the left or right. Now, the next topic I'd like to discuss is the way that Tarkov simulates the recoil impulse of a weapon compared to real life. 9hole Reviews on YouTube has done a fantastic job at capturing what a weapon's recoil impulse actually looks like in real life to the person firing the weapon. I wanted to include this in the outset so that you have a reference to compare to for the following discussion. In real life, when training to maintain the highest level of control on a firearm as possible, you're taught about the importance of the cheek weld, which is firmly pressing your cheek against the stock of the weapon in order to prevent your head from moving independently of the weapon. This is to make sure that your eyes, or eye, are always looking in the same direction the weapon is pointing. But another thing you'll notice in Tarkov is that the shouldered weapons seem to slide off the shoulder slightly when fired, leading to a more exaggerated muzzle rise than otherwise would be. This combined with camera recoil creates a situation where your PMC's head moves independently of the weapon, as though their head's not in contact with the stock whatsoever. This effect is most pronounced with high recoil builds, especially shotguns running Magnum Buck. It causes your PMC's eyes to entirely lose the weapon and sight in your vision when firing rapidly. This effect is also easily seen when the camera recoil is turned off as well. Several months ago, there was a bug discovered that allowed weapons to be fired with zero camera recoil. Many in the community loved this, thinking it was actually an intentional change, as your PMC's head no longer moved erratically independent of the weapon. It's since been patched out, but the effect is still interesting for comparison's sake. This may be entirely subjective, but to me, the recoil impulse seems much more accurate to real life when and only when camera recoil is tweaked to a level where your PMC's head rises at the same rate the muzzle does. This mimics the same effect as if your PMC had a firm cheek weld on the stock. This is the reason why your PMC will entirely lose the red dot on certain weapon builds when firing in full auto. It's not the fault of the gun or the optic, it's because your PMC's head does not move with the weapon. It's because the camera recoil stat is not tuned properly to move your head at the same angle as the muzzle rises. Despite its gamified movement and reload animations, I think Modern Warfare 2019 had some of the most realistic recoil impulses of any game, at least at the time. Recoil felt punchy for large calibers, and while full auto guns seemed to be a little bit too laser beamy, the way in which the weapon recoiled rearward was much more visually pleasing and realistic than it currently is in Tarkov. All in all, I think the addition of the added recoil dispersion this wipe has been the single biggest contributing factor on why gunfights in 12.12 seem to be more drawn out than they were in the past. However, the Convergence stat does need some serious tweaking on certain weapons in my opinion due to the excessive initial muzzle rise on certain weapons. It really doesn't make any sense to me why we have both an auto recoil control system that's meant to represent your PMC pulling down on the weapon to control muzzle rise, and then also requiring players to pull down on the first few shots as well. In addition to that, the gap in performance between stock weapons and fully modded out weapons, in my opinion, does need a little bit of tweaking. Stock and lightly modified weapons should be a bit more viable than they currently are. The M4 in particular, I think, needs a complete overhaul of both the weapon's base stats as well as the modifications. There is such a massive gap between a stock M4 and a meta M4, it just doesn't seem correct. If it were me tweaking these values, M4s could stand having a lower base recoil and having mods offer less of an overall statistical bonus than they currently do, closing the gap between a stock M4 and a completely modded out one. Part 2 of this series is linked in the video description on YouTube and will be showing the effect that these values have on the weapons in-game.